The information flow is endless, and with so many sensational headlines, changing policies, and market fluctuations, it can be tough to keep up with what's most relevant to you as a real estate investor. In Boardroom Brief, we endeavor to discuss and provide our point of view and insights on relevant topics that matter to Greybrook, our investors, and the broader real estate community. Our goal is to provide you with expert opinions in 20 minutes or less.
Sasha, how's it going?
Quite well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I think one of the subjects I kind of like to jump off with is this sort of soft subject of what did you watch last night? And I'll start first because I think it kind of segues into what we want to talk about, because I find myself these days, maybe it's the summer months and there's no good TV on, but I find myself just watching a lot of US and Canadian politics. And it seems like especially the US stuff, if it was a HBO show, I feel like this is the best season yet.
Yeah, it's entertaining.
It's very entertaining. But one of the subjects I find kind of very relevant on both sides of the border that I'd like to chat about is the subject of immigration. And I think that, regardless of what sort of side you lean to, there's this conception that immigration has a very direct correlation to housing affordability.
Yep.
And I think now that we're seeing, our government particularly sort of come out of their 9-year slumber and start to make some changes and policy announcements about immigration, people are starting to think, how is this going to impact them? How is it going to impact housing affordability, even by extension, the job market, et cetera?
Sure.
Your sort of lens on this is obviously a very acute one. What do you think is going to be the trickle down of some of these policy changes?
I think first, the U.S. and Canada, very different dynamic as it relates to immigration and the drivers, as well as some of the issues that people identify. We'll kind of focus our discussion on Canada for the time being. The short answer, I'll give you the long version, but the short answer is I don't expect there to be any negative impact to house price growth or house price stability. And I don't expect there to be a change in the scarcity that we're seeing as it relates to the demand for housing versus the supply of housing. So let me kind of give you some of the reasons I think that that's the case. I think the first thing is the absolute number of people that come into Canada, whether they be temporary foreign workers, permanent residents, students, whatever the case may be. People tend to focus their lens on that number.
Sure.
And a couple of the things that I think people don't focus on enough is not just the composition or the total number, but rather how Canada is comprised as it relates to major metros.
Sure.
And if we let, sort of 1 million new people, 500,000 new people, whatever the case may be, the Southern Ontario region always attracts a vastly disproportional amount of that total. So unlike the US where, if 1 million people came into America, there's about 40 metros that have over 2 million people. Canada only has 3 metros that have over 2 million people. One is French speaking, which may not be appropriate for everybody. The other's on the West Coast. So the economic hub of Canada is concentrated in Southern Ontario, specifically in the Greater Toronto area. It's where a lot of the job growth occurs, and that's where a lot of the urban context is. So people that are coming from parts of the world where they're seeking an urban lifestyle, unlike some other countries, as I just referenced the US as an example, where they have 40 options, they have a couple of options. And what ends up happening is the supply-demand imbalance that is as a result, not just of immigration, but even interprovincial migration. Because of the economic diversity here, because of how much of the economy is situated in Southern Ontario, it's about 25 to 30% of the GDP of the country. As a result of that, we tend to have a vastly greater amount of demand for dwellings on the basis of that need relative to our ability to supply them. So even if you took that number down materially, I would contend that all that would happen is the percentage of the total that would end up in Southern Ontario would just go up, right? Mm-hmm. So if you took that number down from 1 million to 500,000, you'd end up with probably 25% of the total going up to 40 or 50% of the total. And that's simply just a function of where the economy is, right? And as a result of that, I think that the supply-demand imbalance that we see in our housing market will be immaterially impacted by that number increasing or decreasing. The other dimension to this that I really want to point out, because I think it's worth pointing out, is, you opened up with kind of talking a little bit about the political situation. And as it relates to immigration, I think it's too often politicized.
Sure.
I do think, however, that there's a economic reality to what Canada needs in terms of immigration in order to be able to sustain our country and our tax base, right? If you think about the fact that our organic population growth has been decreasing over time, people are getting married later in life, they're having fewer children, that's statistical. Similarly, the boomer population, which was kind of our largest cohort, is now entering their retirement years. So our requirement to be able to continue to grow economically, to continue to grow our GDP, and therefore be able to have the tax base to pay for the social services, for healthcare, for all the things that we've grown accustomed to, we need to replace that working age population. And immigration is the only immediate solution, because if all of a sudden you went on a campaign to try to encourage organically Canadians to have more children, and that's something that might manifest over generations. So I think that today, politics aside, the economic realities are such that you can be a liberal, you can be a conservative, NDP, whatever your political affiliation, you're going to look at the math and know that we require high levels of immigration in order to be able to continue to fund our lifestyles.
I think even, if you look at, specifically Southern Ontario as a marketplace, and you examine housing affordability, even the pre-COVID times, right? When, immigration wasn't such a hot subject like it is today. Affordability was always a conversation. Housing affordability was always a conversation. Now, I think, because of some of the way some of the headlines read, I think people are just trying to, point the finger at times and say, well, what's causing this? My kids can't afford a place, or, you're hearing some of the stats come out about first-time home buyers are starting to age up, right? It's taking longer for people to get into their first home. And I think it's a very sort of natural reaction of this sort of domestic population to say, well, if I have to point my finger at something, maybe it's this. But I think if you look at some of the data points dating back to, probably the last decade, affordability has always been an issue at different levels, at different metrics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I also think that, when the economy is tougher, when things are tougher, and certainly if you look at sort of on a graph, the price of housing, not just in the GTA, but across the country relative to sort of the average salary, that dynamic, there's a big disparity. So that affordability challenge is real. And I think when people, when the economy is not as good, when people see their opportunity set diminished, it's easy to kind of turn around and point the finger at one problem or the other. So I think we have to find that balance, and I do think that as monetary policy shifts, and the market, in my opinion, at least, becomes a lot more sustainable. Like, I think the euphoria that we saw in 2020, 2021, I did a bunch of interviews and podcasts back then, and I talked about the fact that what happened in those years was totally predictable, actually. If you think about what happened to interest rates, if you think about what happened to demand and where that demand was coming from, we had a pandemic that sort of created a recession for one cohort of people and a boom time for another cohort of people, and that manifested itself in the housing market, which is an asset that people tend to gravitate toward. As that unwound, what we're seeing today is also very predictable, and I do think that coming out of this, when the market starts to kind of normalize again, we'll see a much different and more sustainable market. And I think once people see affordability come back within range, and range can be different. Like, range is going to be different in Regina than it is in the greater Toronto area, but still, when that affordability comes back into range, I think people, the heat will come off that rhetoric a little bit, as that anti-immigration rhetoric. The one thing I do wish, however, and this is easier said than done, so I'm not going to be an armchair quarterback and sit there and talk about policies and what they did or didn't do wrong, because it's easy to do that in retrospect. The one thing I do think, though, is the harmonization across different levels of government probably could have been a lot better, right? So if you're reading, today newspapers or watching the news, you're hearing people talk about, we grew too fast for what our infrastructure could accommodate. And I think part of that is just a function of, what our goals are at a federal level, and it's the federal government that sets immigration policy, and what we need to be able to do all the things we talked about, right, to sustain our sort of growth and revenue trajectory, didn't really harmonize with what the provinces were doing as it relates to its projections and growth plan, and then further down the municipalities, who are ultimately in charge of everything that happens from a housing perspective when the rubber hits the road.
Sure, so much infrastructure demand, right? Yeah.
Sure. So we fell very far behind, and as a result of that, I think that, not only is it the economic times that are causing people to kind of point the finger at different things, but they're looking around. They're actually seeing tangible evidence of, like, man, I'm sitting in traffic all day long, and there's way too many people, and all that kind of thing. So the infrastructure hasn't kept up. But we've been making a lot of investments. I would say that all levels of government have identified this as an issue, and I think that over time it will resolve. The impact on housing, I continue to believe that, notwithstanding what it looks like today in this anomaly of a market where interest rates are at 20-year sort of highs, and or maybe not on an absolute basis, but in terms of their acceleration and how quickly they got to where they are, I continue to believe that the scarcity of housing can only lead to one outcome, which is a persistent and sustainable pressure to the upside of housing prices. And we'll see volatility, and affordability levels will change based on monetary policy and other things, but there's just it's simple economics, right? Like, when you have a drastic scarcity, it's simply, there's only one way to go, and that's up.
So when you look at some of the policy changes that they're talking about making right now, or have made, caps on student visas, some pullback on the temporary foreign worker program, you think about sort of the income earner equivalent of those types of populations. So it sounds like, and I'm just forecasting on behalf of the government, it sounds like they're trying to sort of do a slight shift into the type of immigration that they're bringing in. So from a sort of institutional investor level that we are here at Greybrook, are we changing our viewpoint? Are we changing the way we're looking at deal flow, or are we changing the way we're underwriting stuff? Like, are we looking more at low rise, or is that more of interest to us, maybe more south of the border? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we were ahead of that curve. Like we probably from 2004 to 2011 almost exclusively invested in high rise, because that's where we saw the growth occurring. And then as affordability became a challenge, a lot of these high-rise projects, your average unit size went from 1,000 square feet to 900 square feet to probably about 550 square feet or somewhere thereabouts now, from one parking stall per unit to no parking in some cases. So what that means is, as affordability continues to become an issue, you can only shrink units and sort of change the parameters of the living space so much to be able to reduce that overall chunk rate, and people need space. So what ends up happening is, you start to go peripherally, right? So it's vertically, and then you start to go peripherally, and you start to develop into these markets that are maybe peripheral to Toronto, but still have accessibility to Toronto. And that's where sort of we probably come 2012 started to really invest in heavily and look at. So to your point, low rise. High rise can't accommodate all types of families, so you need to have space in some cases, and the only way to do that is to develop more dense forms of housing that are ground related forms of housing, so things like townhouses and stacked townhouses in the peripheries of these markets. And I think that's probably, as the tweaks to policy from immigration policy specifically come to be and come to pass over time, I think that they'll have some impacts on the peripheral, like in terms of, I don't see deep impacts. I don't see a change in the dynamic of scarcity that we've talked about. I see there being sort of little impacts on the edges, but that's where I do think that different formats of housing in different peripheral markets become a lot more prevalent. So, to answer the question you asked, which was how do we think about that? We take all this into account, and if you look at the composition of our overall portfolio from kind of '05 to 2012, and then look at a snapshot from 2012 or 13 to today, it's probably gone from 80 or 90% high rise to about 70% low rise, right? As it relates to the entire portfolio, and it's all centered around creating affordability. So even within our high rise portfolio, we focus on submarkets that might not be like right in the downtown center of Toronto, but rather in areas like the Queensway area or the Upper Junction or Stockyards or Broadview and Danforth, for example. Like, so these markets are still very accessible, particularly by public transit, and yet there's a step down in terms of their overall affordability, sure, which allows it's more accessible to a greater number of people. So that's kind of how we're changing our strategy. So I wouldn't say that's a fundamental change. It's simply like changing the angle or our trajectory as to what we're focusing on, and that's kind of the things that we look for. And I would say that today the bigger focus is even on identifying the next phases of development. So looking at urban boundaries and looking for property that we believe inevitably, due to their proximity to services, due to their proximity to the existing urban boundaries and where housing has evolved, that'll be the next sort of layer. And there's a lot of value that you can create, obviously, by identifying those types of properties and being able to bring them through the process.
And I think one of the arguments, sort of to switch it to the devil's advocate argument on immigration, is one of the arguments that is opposing limitation on immigration, or saying, we need to keep it up. And I think you've alluded to the fact that, we have an aging boomer population, and we have the need for economic growth. But there's essentially two industries that have been identified as like truly having labor shortages. It's healthcare and construction. So we're essentially in the construction business. Although it seems there's no official announcements yet on the any impact on those types of industries. That they've made some announcements about the 10% of the temporary foreign worker policy, and not hiring in markets that have unemployment greater than 6%. But do you think that the immigration policies have had an impact on easing up the labor shortages, specifically within construction? Have you found it easier to sort of source construction and kind of get stuff built?
That's a good question. I don't think yet. If we're seeing any impact, it's minimal at this point. I do hope it'll improve. One of the reasons, I'm the child of immigrants, and when my parents came here in the 60s, they were coming here to provide me with a better life, or their definition of a better life, which is go to school, get your degree, and you don't want to be sweating outside hammering nails into a board like I was. And then sort of we bred an economy of my generation that became much more educated, but sort of left the trades behind in a lot of ways, right? So all of a sudden you have like way more pick a profession, lawyers or public school teachers than you need.
Service people,
right? Yeah. But you don't have enough in the trades. So I think immigration is going to fulfill some of that going forward as we begin to kind of shift back. It's like a pendulum, like anything else. But I also think that there's people domestically that are now looking at career opportunities. They're getting through school and they're saying, you know what, maybe I don't want to go and become a geography teacher or a computer scientist or a private equity person. Maybe I want to learn, to get into one of the trades. It can be very lucrative. I can make a steady living and not just a living. And there's a lot of demand for it. So I do think that we're going to see a shift. I just don't know how near term it's going to be to alleviate any of the existing pressures. I don't think that there's any magic bullet where all of a sudden you're going to see this huge influx of drywallers I just don't see it. But I do think over time we're going to start seeing some of that pressure come off, and it'll be as a result of the couple of factors that we just talked about.
Yeah, and I think if the government makes a concentrated effort on sort of, quote unquote, filtering those types of trades, or, if there's really a demand for plumbers or drywallers and saying, okay, that's how we'll run future policy, I think it would be welcomed by industry and by current citizens.
I think so. Look, I think our industry, notwithstanding challenges that we might see today, notwithstanding we've seen challenges I don't want to say like this, like we've seen other challenges in the past. We saw some during the global financial crisis. We saw some before that. We saw that when the Fair Housing Plan came out. Like it's just different, right?
Yeah.
But always there's different headwinds that you have to deal with. I do think that the industry would benefit from more resources in this sector to be able to meet some of the demand that you know we have to meet ultimately. But as an investor, I don't think we're so far from being able to do that.
Sure.
Any improvement would be welcome, not unwelcome. And I say, what I mean is, you know, sometimes if all of a sudden you could snap your fingers and you have all the resources you need and you can build as many homes as you need to house every single individual that needs one, well, it wouldn't be that great of an investment.
Yeah.
Like you need fundamental scarcity to promote stability. Now, you don't need as much as we have because it leads to other issues.
Too much to the one side.
Right? But like frankly, if immigration came down a bit and the amount of people that flowed into trades freed up some of the resources and we had more ability as an industry to create supply, that would be great because it would still be a great investment. And at the end of the day, some of the friction in the model would dissipate.
Healthier,
and I
balanced
think
market.
it'd be better for everyone.
Thank you, Sasha. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was great talking.